day to you, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Sermon Time, where I am your host, Pastor Tony, sharing with you insights into the Bible I gained while traveling through Israel. Recently, we've been looking into the parables of Jesus, object lessons he took from everyday common elements of life, put them into story form, and applied them to the spiritual lives of the Jews of the first century. And every time we have done this, we have seen how his lessons become more powerful, more meaningful, more timeless, and every bit more relevant when we take the time to understand the context of these stories. Today will be no exception. The title of our message is Good for Something Disciples. To be perfectly honest, I was considering good for nothing disciples, but that kind of sounded like a downer, even though I copied word for word from our story today, Jesus' parable of the salt that lost its savor. An interesting point about this parable is that it is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it comes up in three totally different contexts. In Matthew, it comes up in the context of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount early in his ministry in the northern region of the Sea of Galilee. In Mark, it comes up much later, right after Jesus' transfiguration on the mountain near Capernaum. And Luke couches it in the middle of a series of parables he is addressing to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. This fact, by the way, has led some critics of the Bible to conclude that the Bible cannot have divine authorship because the writers can't seem to get their story straight as to when and where Jesus told this parable. But herein is their fatal assumption. There is no reason to conclude that Jesus only told this story once, and that was it. There is no rule that says he couldn't have shared it at different times to different people and brought different lessons out of it. Our assumption will be Matthew, Mark, and Luke record three separate occasions using basically the same material. But because they are all different, and we don't have time for all three of them, I'm going to choose Mark for our consideration today, and only dabble briefly in Matthew and Luke. Here's the passage in Mark chapter 9, verse 50. Salt is good, but if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another. That's it, in its entirety. Salt is good, but if it loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another. Matthew and Luke add the fact that if the salt loses its saltiness, it's good for nothing. It's thrown out and it's trampled underfoot. Are you kind of scratching your head yet? Any ideas as to what Jesus is driving at? Or why three gospel writers included this account in their writings? Can you see how easy it might be to just skip right past this verse, just keep reading until something really good comes up? But the thing is, everything Jesus ever told was really good. And even though Mark squeezes the lesson into one verse, it is full of meaning and power. So we're going to have to stick it into low gear, four-wheel drive, and take this story inch by inch. Let's start with the salt itself. Most of the salt in the area of Israel comes from the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is a massive below sea level salt mine. In this image here, you can see the white coastline. That's not the sea foam of waves hitting the shore. It's salt. In fact, the flats on the western shore of the Dead Sea are so salty, precious little grows there. It seems, though, that Israel's world-famous medjool dates do just fine. The Dead Sea comes in 10 times saltier than ordinary ocean water, with a salinity of 33.7%. Have you ever heard of somebody drowning in the ocean? Well, that is almost impossible to do in the Dead Sea. Here's my wife and I having a little fun taking a dip in the Dead Sea this last spring. It is so salty, you float. The salt harvested from the Dead Sea is usually found on the land near the sea, not from the sea itself. Hence the expression in Matthew, the salt of the earth. Such salt was used for a variety of purposes. One commentary mentions salt was used for preserving, purifying, seasoning, fertilizing, and so on. There is the possibility of salt as a metaphor for wisdom, as well as various other associations like sacrificial, covenantal, and moral. And they cited a bunch of verses as examples of each of these. The facilities used to harvest the salt were so crude that the salt could become mixed with impurities native to the shores of the Dead Sea. Not your normal sodium chloride we are used to on American tables. Sometimes, though, the dampness and rains of the area could leach the salt out of this impure mixture, leaving nothing but the impurities. Saltless salt, or more accurately, insipid salt. The idea being expressed in Jesus' parable is this: if food loses its flavor, you can salt it. But if the salt loses its flavor, there's nothing you can do about it. It's as it says in Matthew, good for nothing. All this is pretty clear from the texts of the Bible itself. What isn't clear is what Mark records Jesus saying next. Salt is good, but if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another. It's that last phrase, have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another, that throws a question mark on the whole thing. How did salt become a metaphor for peace between us and our fellow believers? To get to the answer to that, we need the rest of Mark, chapter 9. Mark 9 starts with an account of Jesus choosing 3 of his disciples, only 3 of them, and climbing a mountain near Capernaum. They were Peter, James, and John, Jesus' 3 favorite disciples. When they arrived at the summit, Jesus' figure became transformed. It started to glow. Moses and Elijah came to visit Jesus to strengthen him before his trial at the cross. God's voice spoke on this occasion, saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." When the 3 disciples descended the mountain with Jesus, they were met with a very confused situation. The disciples who had been left behind seemed chagrined. The Pharisees looked proud and puffed up, and a father came forward with a request to heal his demon-possessed boy. He told Jesus, "Your disciples tried to cast out the demon, but they could not." The Pharisees sought to exploit the disciples' failure, claiming the whole Jesus movement was nothing but a fraud, and they were winning over the hearts of the onlookers. I mean, the disciples of Jesus who once had the power to cast out demons when Jesus sent them on their first mission were now powerless to do anything to help. Well, I'm sure you know the story. Jesus heals the demon-possessed boy, bringing wholeness to the boy, joy to his father, and credibility back to his cause. The Pharisees were completely embarrassed because what once was evidence of what they claimed as the fraud of Jesus was now proof of his authenticity. The Pharisees couldn't heal the demoniac any more than the disciples, but it became apparent Jesus could, poking a giant hole in their watertight argument against him. Later, Jesus and the disciples were alone at the house where they were staying, and the disciples asked Jesus, "Why couldn't we cast out the demon?" So he said to them, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." Now, to get to what Jesus is talking about here, you need a little backstory. The 9 disciples who did not go with Jesus and Peter and James and John up the Mount of Transfiguration, they had been down in the valley smarting over their hurt pride. They wanted the privilege the 3 enjoyed. They wanted an answer to how come they had to remain behind. They were jealous and coveted what the other disciples had in their special relationship with Jesus. It was this jealous spirit that they had allowed to take control of their thoughts and feelings that disqualified them to cast out the demon from the boy. And why? Because they had been overtaken by a foul spirit themselves. They had let their guard down. They had cultivated a spirit of jealousy. They had ceased to watch and pray, and Jesus had left them behind so they could think upon the lessons that he had been teaching them, so that they could pray and grow and hone their discipleship skills. But no, they weren't having any of that, and it was for their lack of readiness that they failed the test when it came. It is a universal truth. You cannot give what you do not have. They had lost their deliverance in Jesus, and they could not provide it to anybody else. If Jesus hadn't showed up when he did, the disciples' lack of preparedness and readiness would have done irreparable harm to his cause. The disciples had lost their saltiness and had become good for nothing. And that sad state of affairs had discredited Jesus. And so it is with followers of Jesus today. The devil knows that the best way to make Christianity today of no effect, as valuable as insipid salt, is to create divisions in the church, to get members and leaders fighting over things that have little to no significance, to distract us from our real work of healing and saving the masses, and to get us on any topic other than the essential preparation we all need to be ready for Jesus to come and to get others ready for the same. Jealousies, wanting what some other church has, or get us talking about stuff that doesn't really matter in the bigger picture of things. Name your topic. Is it okay to ordain women? Should we have closed the doors of our church during the pandemic? Are masks as effective as the scientists proclaim? Are Democratic or Republicans going to run our form of government into the ground? Should abortion be legalized, or are we going to give government another way to control the private affairs of our lives? All of this, I claim, is rubbish. All devices, all tools of the enemy to divide us and to steal away our saltiness in the world. And how can I say this? Aren't these issues important? Shouldn't we make our voices known of where we stand as Christians? Maybe. But I say this because the fact that there are pandemics and divisions in politics and people becoming hatefully divided one against another over this or that or the other thing are all signs that we are at the end of all things. Jesus is coming soon, and there is only one task that stands in our way of going home: the preaching of the gospel to the world. It and nothing else should be our work. And this gospel, Jesus said, of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. This task of giving the good news to everybody in the world should consume us, bankrupt us, work us to the bone. Instead of fighting over who is right or wrong on any given topic, brothers and sisters, the counsel given to us who live in the midst of these divisions at the end of time is to press together, press together, press together. We cannot afford a moment of time to be swept up in the world's craziness. We are to bring sanity to it, and we do that when we stand united on our message of salvation in Jesus Christ. This unity is only possible if we do not neglect our Christian duties that keep us connected to Jesus and each other: Bible study, prayer, fasting, Christian service to our fellow man. The elders of our church and I have had several conversations, and to the elder, when asked what we should do about divisions regarding politics or other social issues, to the elder, the message was unequivocally clear: we stand together with Jesus Christ. The kingdoms of this world and America with it are going to fall, but the kingdom of Christ is taking over the world, and it will stand forever. This is our message, and this is our moment to decide which it's going to be for us. What will this generation do when faced with the decision to choose Christ and to share Christ? I hope you will choose to be a follower of Jesus Christ, and not just a follower, but a salty follower. A salty follower that chooses to have salt in themselves, preserving them from the world's decaying influence and peace with one another, not allowing anything to distract them from the task at hand, a task that can only be accomplished when we stand and work together. Jesus says it so simply. Have salt in yourselves. He's like, you are saltless. You have lost your saltiness. You have lost your salinity. You are insipid. But have salt in yourselves. It's not complicated. It's just that simple. Stop with the divisions. Be at peace with your brothers and sisters in Christ. You know, it wasn't long after this incident on the Mount of Transfiguration that the disciples were at it again. In Mark 9, same chapter, verse 34, it says that as they were heading home, they had been disputing among themselves as to who would be the greatest. It seems the disciples were fighting where the battle wasn't, among themselves. And it seems this pattern was cyclical. Repeatedly, they viewed each other not as partners with Christ in the greatest work ever entrusted to mankind, but as competitors vying for the best positions in the kingdom. What they didn't know is that through this attitude, they had lost their position in the kingdom altogether. Let us consider a statement made about 130 years ago, identifying this problem among the early believers in the Advent message. This comes from the Review and Herald, October 17, 1893. When men arise, claiming to have a message from God, but instead of warring against principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this world, they form a hollow square and turn the weapons of their warfare against the church. Be afraid of them. They do not bear the divine credentials. God has not given them any such burden of labor. They would tear down that which God would restore. It's been quite a while since our church here has experienced anything like this, and that's what concerns me. As with the disciples of old, these things tend to come in cycles. All it takes is one disciple who neglects to pray and fast and study and serve. They take the weapons of their warfare that are meant to battle the evil around, and they turn them inward on the church. Discontentment is cherished, strife is fostered, divisions arise, and suddenly the good thing you had going succumbs to the corrupting influences of the world. We have got to get this right. We have to have salt in ourselves. We have to maintain peace with one another. We have to stay connected to Jesus. The Word Biblical Commentary closes its comments on our verse in Mark 9, verse 50 with this thought. As salt is vitally necessary for everyday life, the disciples are vitally significant and necessary to the world in their witness to God and His kingdom. Right there, that's the important thing. Who we are to the world. Lose our saltiness and our influence to preserve is lost. The evil of our world instead overtakes us, and we become good for nothing. Become salty. Put a stop to the divisions and unite yourself one to another and to Christ. And we may very well save the world. Well, I wish you God's blessing. And until next week, may He be with you all.